Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a un día más, a una sesión más de nuestro programa en sesgos narrativos sobre los cuerpos, tecnologías de la justicia y el ADN. El día de hoy, concretamente, vamos a estar en varias actividades, en varias sesiones, empezando en este momento con la participación del doctor, ¿no? Sandberg, pues ya alguien con quien he tenido oportunidad de platicar desde hace tiempo, interesada en sus temas de investigación. Y bueno, pues una de las razones por las que consideramos pensar este evento con una perspectiva mucho más, digamos, diversa, mucho más amplia. Justamente ahorita platicábamos un poco fuera de la pantalla el tema de cómo combinar las perspectivas académicas con las perspectivas artísticas. Y bueno, parte importante de lo que va a suceder el día de hoy tiene que ver justamente con mostrar todas estas perspectivas, pues más que nada perspectivas de reflexión, ¿no? Primero que nada pues la plática la presentación va a ser en inglés y posteriormente vamos a tener el video, va a quedar el video tanto en la página del Centro de Ciencias Genómicas como en la página del Centro Multimedia del CENART, para que puedan ustedes consultarlo ya con subtítulos. Va a ser una presentación, Sven va a hacer una presentación pues de los proyectos, porque además es alguien ahorita voy a leer su reseña, van a ver que es alguien con una amplia trayectoria y alguien que que ha ido moviéndose no solamente desde lo teórico a lo metodológico, a lo experimental, pero también alguien que se ha movido de diferentes latitudes, ¿no? Y bueno, pues ahorita particularmente está iniciando un proyecto que tiene que ver con América Latina, que eventualmente nos hablará también de eso. Y bueno, voy a leer su reseña en este momento. La voy a leer en español. No creo que haya problema que la lea en español por él. Pero bueno, vamos a ver. Sveinung Sandberg es profesor del Departamento de Criminología y Derecho de la Universidad de Oslo, en Noruega. Su investigación se enfoca en los procesos de marginalización, violencia, masculinidad, drogas ilegales, radicalización y movimientos sociales. En lo teórico ha publicado extensamente sobre el concepto capital de la calle, que introduce las teorías de Pierre Bourdieu en el estudio de la cultura de la calle. Particularmente con su libro Street Capital, Black Cannabis Dealers in a White Welfare State. La última década ha contribuido en primera línea a la articulación de la criminología narrativa, una metodología que introduce y utiliza la lingüística, la narratología en los estudios del delito y el sistema de justicia criminal. En su trabajo empírico ha utilizado la criminología narrativa para estudiar distintos fenómenos, tales como el tráfico de drogas y el contrabando en el norte de Europa, el uso de cannabis y psicodélicos, el uso excesivo de alcohol, la radicalización de la derecha, la yihad, el terrorismo, el desarrollo de crímenes durante la pandemia por COVID-19 y prisiones en México. Recientemente terminó un proyecto de investigación de gran impacto sobre radicalización y resistencia, sobre extremismo religioso en el norte de Europa, y recién inició otro sobre CRIMLA, ¿no? Criminología en América Latina. Este último integra a un grupo de más de 18 investigadores que colectan entrevistas de historias de vida de prisiones en 6 diferentes países latinoamericanos. Okay, well, this is just a very brief pues a sample of all the things that you have done. We are very grateful. We are very happy to have you here. I have followed your work for a while, and I think this is a very your approach to criminology is is a very, I think it's a very valuable, a very important, and very necessary approach for for extreme context like the one we live in Mexico. Um, but I don't want to bias, the talk, because I know you have done so many things, and you have studied different phenomena in Europe, more like towards Asia, and now Latin America, and so. But I just want to say that one of the reasons that I find very, very relevant that you are in this event is that I can see that you have a very transdisciplinary approach and view on very, very complex phenomenon. So I think that's a very necessary, as I said, approach in order to understand that these kind of complex problems or situations that social events, social facts, or social realities need to be seen from. I mean, it's not enough just to use one discipline, one kind of view, perspective, that they need to be seen from a very, very wide, and maybe wild as well, approach. So I'm going to be quiet now, because we want to listen to you, to hear your reflections, your ideas. And once you have finished with your presentation, the idea is that we can have a kind of dialogue with the audience. And of course, I have questions I want to ask you about your work. I just see that I just read this emotions article related with the Black Lives Matter movement. And well, there are so many things that I think we can we can ask you. Okay, so please, thank you very much, and now it's your time, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Claudia, for the invitation, and thanks for everyone that's listening and that came in here. I'm sorry that I have to keep it in English, but that's the only way to for me to do this. I mean, unfortunately, my Spanish is not good enough for these kinds of things. Can you see the PowerPoint now, or?
Ah, yes, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, let me see, because I need it up to. Okay, so everything is good with the PowerPoint. Uh, Claudia, is everything good with the PowerPoint? I can start?
Yes. Yes. Can you see it in your screen?
Yeah, I have it.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, so first, apologies for the Spanish. Apologies for all the doors behind me. I couldn't find a better place, but it's the best I could find in my bedroom right now. And also, I have to say, I think it's strange, and because the topic is bodies, like cuerpos, and it's strange to have a presentation where I can only see my own my own PowerPoint presentation, and to talk about bodies. No, I mean, I don't know now. I don't know if there are three people there or if there are 25 or whatever. I can't see facial expressions when I talk. You mentioned emotions, right? Usually, when you have a talk, you can see, this connects to people. You can get some resonance. You can kind of move the talk in the direction of where you you feel that the audience is going. So, in my opinion, this pandemic has been terrible in numerous ways, but also in the way we relate to each other, I think, when everything is on screen all the time. And I don't think humans are made in that way that they can really express emotion, that they really can kind of relate to other bodies without being in the same room, without being present at the same time, without being able to see each other, but not only see each other on the screen, but see the whole body and the whole bodily language and so on. So I apologize if the presentation is strange, but that might be part of the explanation. That's my excuse. If you think it's strange, that would be my excuse.
Sven, sorry, just one thing. Could you please put like a full screen on your PPT?
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it also relates to the talk, because when we talk about Contranarrativas de los cuerpos en el encierro, I think it's necessary with a method where you go out in a prison, where you see people, where you can talk to them there, where you can kind of be in their presence. And I was super worried when we started this project that somehow the pandemic would close the prisons completely, as they were for a long time. So we had to delay it a little bit, so that we would have to use other kinds of data where you maybe organized Zoom interviews or something like that. And I really didn't want it, because I think in order to capture emotion, in order to capture bodies, and in order to capture narratives, and for me narratives are tightly connected to emotions and bodies. So you can't just read them, you can't just ask them to write a letter with their life story or something. I think you have to be there to see the whole picture. So I was really glad. I'm going to return to that later and talk, but I was really glad that we were able to actually get inside of prison and hang out there a little bit, to meet and see people. And in order to get the data, I think we need, as social scientists, for these kinds of studies. There are too many studies that are too far away from bodies, from actual people, and we try to theorize, we try to think about it, and then we kind of remove the experiences, we remove these lives from the actual setting they are in, and we move it into some kind of academic office space, theoretical, where we kind of lift it completely out of the lived experiences. And I think if we have met people, if we have been there, if we have seen them, it's hard to forget. So it always puts some kind of limitations to the kind of theorizing we can do. I mean, we will always have to remember that these are actual people living actual lives in actual spaces. So I'm really glad for that, and this is important for me, because as my career had moved from being like working alone as an ethnographer, doing all the interviews myself, transcribing myself, and so on, and now that I'm organizing this big project with 18 researchers doing interviews, it's important always for me to remind myself that I have to remember that these are not only words on paper or in doc file, but these are real people out there, and we try to, as best as possible, connect the stories to actual bodies. Okay, please let me know if I disappear from the screen, because I can't see my own face either. So if I'm out of the screen, let me know.
Yes, just could you please put a like full screen on the so we just see the slide that you are addressing to, because now we see other.
Mine is full screen.
Because we don't see the full screen. We just see like the.
Okay, let me. Mine was full screen previously, but maybe I did it wrong. Okay, stop. I go here like this. Okay, I don't know how to do that.
I think it's on the last.
Maybe on the bottom right of the PowerPoint, next to the zoom buttons, there's if you can click the next button that is like the slide starter. Next to the minus on the bottom right of the PowerPoint.
Next to the minus. In my own PowerPoint, or
in your own PowerPoint, yes. No, the next one, no, that's the plus. No.
On the left.
On the left. No.
On the left, the other one.
No, right next to the minus, the icon that is just left to the minus that you were. There
you go. Yeah.
This one. Is better now? Now it's full screen on my.
Yeah, it seems so, but somehow it's not reading it like it.
Well, it doesn't matter. We can deal with it.
Go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the approach I have taken the last years is this one of narrative. This is what we call narrative criminology, and the basic argument there is that there has never been anywhere any people without narrative. So it's kind of substantial, important, fundamental part of human life. So in order to understand human life, we need to understand the stories people tell. I mean, language is basically what distinguishes humans from animals, no? Or at least one of the most important things. I mean, there are no animals with a language, and language is what makes organizing big communities, big societies, but also small communities and small societies. It's very hard to imagine a society without a language. So stories work to implot lives. They offer a plot that makes some particular future not only plausible but also compelling. So it makes imagining things possible and also compelling in a way that this is how we want to do it. This is what life we want, and so on. And we defined narrative criminology. I mean, of course, it lends from narratology, from linguistics, from all these narrative sociology, both from humanities and the social sciences. So it's really just taking this concept and taking these theories and ideas into a new discipline, which is criminology, which is where I'm now. I'm trained as a sociologist, but now I work in a criminology department and kind of focus my work there. And what we did to kind of twist it or make it fit into that area is defining narrative criminology as any inquiry based on the view of stories as instigating, sustaining, or affecting desistance from harmful action. So we try to link the storytelling to some actual outcomes in the real world, if you want to call it that. These stories are not only stories, they have consequences, they have influences, they change life, they influence life. So in a good way, in terms of desistance, for example, making people stop crime, but also in the bad way often, that the crime they do are inspired by the stories they've heard. They try to often, for example, they try to copy crimes and so on. Crimes they've heard about. School shootings would be like, we just had another one in the United States now. You can see that history of school shooting, how the one school shooter copies the next one and so on. And also in street culture, which is my main area of research, you can see how people redo stories, how they mix them with things they've seen in movies and heard about in certain kinds of music, and they kind of reproduce these stories that makes them commits them to crime and violent crime and these kinds of problems. So the book that Claudia mentioned, Street Capital, is one example of how you can collect stories and theorize on stories and so on. And here we combined it with Bourdieu, with the concept of habitus and capital and stuff, which is particularly relevant for this talk, I guess, since you have this emphasis on bodies. So that study was one of my first studies, and a 1-year ethnographic fieldwork with street drug dealers, Somali street drug dealers mostly, or other with African background in Oslo, in Norway. But I've also done other studies with this narrative approach, where we collect stories, where we try to understand stories. One, for example, on the social supply of drugs, which was more a middle class people selling marijuana primarily, and also later after that, a big study of imprisoned high-level drug dealers, also in Norway. And the latter one kind of inspired the recent study that we're doing now in Mexico and some other Latin American countries. So what kind of research questions can or are inspired by narrative analysis or narrative theory? And I think very easily the first one is descriptive. It is just about what kind of stories do people tell. It's just going out there to see what are the dominant stories, what are the kind of most common stories, and try to systematize them, or try to collect them, or try to see their main points or plots or so on in that. So I think one of the most important questions in a narrative study is just, we have all these assumptions about what stories are important, but we don't know until we get out there and until we do talk to people and try to collect some of them. So sometimes it's just seeing, okay, what are the important stories, and then we can start to theorize afterwards. What do these stories do? What's the problem with them? What are the benefits? How are they organized? What's their structure, and so on. But primarily, we have to do some kind of empirical work, I think, in order to figure out if our assumptions about what stories are important really fit the life outside of our offices.
Sven, sorry for interrupting you, but could you push escape? Because we haven't, the screen got frozen, so we just see the first 3 slides. It hasn't moved. If you can just, yeah, there you go. Perfect. Thank you.
This is better? Okay.
Yes, now it's moving. Thank you.
Okay. So you didn't see this one. Did you see this one?
No.
Okay.
No. We saw the first 3, so this one we didn't see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please let me know if there are any other troubles during that talk. Thank you, Claudia. You can see this one?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So these are the kind of questions we can ask with a narrative approach. What kind of stories do people tell? Primarily descriptive. Then what are the characteristics? Genre, what kind of genre is it? What are the contents? And then it gets increasingly like complex. What kind of work do they do for storytellers? That's the phrase I prefer, work they do, instead of like strategies or making it too kind of strategic or conscious. I don't think storytelling is very conscious. I think it's more embodied, if you want to say it that way. It's kind of part of who you are in a way that you don't always realize yourself. So people don't go around have strategies for their storytellings. I mean, they might have in some particular cases, but usually they just either reproduce the society they're in, the culture they're in, through their storytelling, or they just go into storytelling in ways that are embodied and narrative, and so on. And then also, I think it's important to look for how stories are linked to the socioeconomic context, how we can see stories coming out of particular contexts, and how they work in that way. So some people would say, no, the socioeconomic context is the most important, like poverty, oppression, and so on. And these narrative approaches or these radical constructivist approaches are just looking at the surface and so on. But I think that in order to understand the socioeconomic context, we need to understand the stories people tell about it. And in order to understand stories, we need to understand the socioeconomic context around it. Because it kind of frames, it kind of embeds all the storytelling. So just to give you a few examples of storytelling from that first study I did, this is from Ali, one of the Somali drug dealers. I asked him, do you have a girlfriend? And he starts saying, yeah, I have this girlfriend. But then he starts this story that he really want to tell. So he kind of expects me to not worry too much about his girlfriend, but he thinks that my question, what I'm really interested in, is why he's dealing drugs on these streets where I was doing my ethnography. So he goes directly, he just skips the question and he goes into explaining, yeah, it's hard. I have these problems. I can't get a job. There is discrimination. Norway is an expensive country, and so on. And you need cash, and I need cash. So he goes directly into this story that we describe as a victim narrative. I mean, he explains his action as the result of problems, discrimination, and lack of opportunities. And looking at all this data when I was collecting for over a year, I could see that this was a very typical story. It's kind of what we describe as victim narratives. It doesn't mean that it's not true. Calling something a narrative doesn't mean that it's unrelated to real limits or real problems in a society, but it only means that it is a particular way to talk about your experiences. And what made this particularly clear was that how you could see how some people would change from this story to another story that was important. And the other story that was important in this study was what we describe as gangster narratives. And these are stories about how they are successful criminals, how they make a lot of money, how they have all these girlfriends, how they're really better than you in so many ways. So while the victim narrative stories is a way to try to create sympathy by saying we're equal, had you been in the same situation, you would have ended up doing the same as me. The gangster narrative is a way of seeking respect, trying to place themselves above you as better, and so on. And it's very fascinating because you would imagine that life on the streets of a welfare state in Europe would be very different from life in Mexican prisons, for example. But if you look at these kind of story structures, I can see a lot of similarities in these ways of either talking about your life in terms of a victim narrative or talking about it in this kind of subculture gangster way. And most importantly, I think people are not committed to either one story or another story. Some people would be like 100% gangster, and that they wouldn't leave this kind of narrative. They wouldn't leave this discourse during a conversation. But for most people, it would be switches. They would talk about their life in one sense as a victim, and then in another one as a gangster, and so on, and move very fluently between these different stories. So doing even more studies of street culture and of different types of offenders, together with Jennifer Fleetwood, we tried to make this kind of overview over what we describe as the narrative repertoire of street culture. So we tried to see what kind of stories are common in all these different environments. What it's descriptive in that sense. What were the stories that were dominating in this place? And we found stories of violence as very important. Crime success stories is very important. Stories about drugs, of course, is very important. And also these stories about hard life, how they, for example, manage to get out of very difficult family situations and so on. And the two first one are kind of stereotypical in a way, and maybe what you expect, and maybe what you would see in movies and so on. But the two next ones are a little bit more complex, because you want to have some drug experiences, you want to have kind of lived a life, you want to have seen things, you want to know things that a lot of people don't know because they're not doing these drugs. At the same time, you want to avoid being the addict, which is a very stigmatized position or identity in street culture, in these environments. And also the hard life stories are difficult because they're kind of borderline to being just victims. So very often we saw people talking about being abused as a child, having a problematic family, having experienced violence in different traumatic ways. And then in order, we believe, to kind of avoid this pure victim story, which is not a good one in street culture either, they would use it to say that, okay, that made me hard, that made me tough, that made me able to function in this environment that I'm in now. So they kind of combine the victim stories with the gangster conclusion. The plot was kind of built up like that. And of course, all these stories are embodied. So they're connected to people being able to tell them in a convincing way through their bodies. And sometimes they have to fight to prove that their stories are right and so on. And it's not stories that they can avoid, because they can even be printed on them in terms of tattoos and so on. And this is what makes change difficult, right? The habitus people have, the kind of embodiment of the culture that they are in and the experience they have. So even if they want to cognitively, they wouldn't be able to change from one day to other their way of behaving, because it's embodied, and also the way of talking, because it's embodied. So, for example, one guy said, well, I've been in this criminal environment for 10 years, and when I tried to get out, I started working in a store at the bottom level of the hierarchy and so on, and I had no idea what to talk to with people, because they were talking about stuff on TV that they had seen about their families, about what we would say maybe normal stuff, and he didn't have a narrative repertoire for that kind of normal small talk that people do, and that was part of the problem of him being there and trying to reintegrate into society. That he had a perfect narrative repertoire for being on the street, right? He could tell and convince everyone that he was a violent, dangerous guy, and he could talk about his crime success stories, how he had tricked the police, how he had made all this money. But when he was in a different environment, different context, none of these stories were kind of normal to tell, or would put him in a position that would make him a kind of colleague or friend in a normal way. So he understood that he had to leave all these stories behind, all these embodied stories behind, but he didn't know how to talk about these other things. So that's the kind of that's how narratives play into the systems, how it plays into people trying to change their lives and so on. Types of narrative. In one paper, I've distinguished between life stories, single event stories, and tropes. So stories can be the full life. This is what we are collecting now in Mexico and other places. We talk to people several times. We try to get everything in there. But narrative analysis can also be done on more single event stories. Like we just take one story and look at how that one is organized. And I think it's also important to remember the tropes and the hidden stories. Like sometimes some stories are so dominant that people just need a small hint to get the stories. So that might be the most hegemonic discourse, the most hegemonic narratives, those that you don't even have to tell because everyone just takes them for granted, right? So doing narrative analysis, we can look for the life stories, we can look for single event stories, and we can also look for these small hints at stories and even silences. What stories are silenced? So just one example of this trope, this guy I interviewed in prison in Norway. Can you talk about your childhood? I asked him, and he says it was turbulent. Child protective services, foster care, group homes, that sort of thing. And I kept probing. I kept trying to get more details, but he would refuse to say more than just this. And I think that's because he knew that I knew where this story was going. Right? Child protective service means that you have problems at home. Foster care means that you're taking from your family, and if you don't manage, if the foster parents doesn't want you anymore, they move you to a group home. So that means he got problems with his foster care as well, and so on. So he knew that his story was a common one, and he just gave me these tropes or these hints as in order to let me be able to make up my own story. This is what we do with tropes, right? They are ambiguous, so they open up for the listeners. If I want to appeal to as many people as possible, sometimes people will try to keep their phrases ambiguous. You can see this with politicians, for example. They want to appeal to different groups, so they state things in a kind of open way where people can interpret it the way they want. So this is why I think it's important also to look for these stories that are not necessarily told in every interviews, because all stories, I guess, are open-ended. They are not easy to interpret. They have this kind of ambiguity, bricolage characteristics over them that they can go in different directions. I mean, you can tell one story and someone else can interpret it in a completely different way. And you can also mix stories, many different stories present simultaneously. It's kind of interdiscursivity. For example, in the switches between victim stories, gangster stories, or whatever, and how people jump in and out of that. I've worked quite a lot with exactly that, how people jump in and out of stories and how they have several stories present simultaneously. And I think that's really important in order not to reduce people to simple stereotypes, to try to see the whole full repertoire of the stories they have. So why are these narratives important? Isaac Babel said that a well thought out story doesn't need to resemble real life, because real life itself tries with all its might to resemble a well crafted story. And criminal offenders, as everyone else, as we do, as scientists or artists or whatever we are, we use the narrative repertoire of particular cultures to implot our lives. So we use culture stories out there in order to give our own lives a particular direction. We want to be these people that we have read about, that we admire, that we look up to, and so on. So we try to kind of direct our own lives in the directions of the stories we have heard. And this is also the case for criminal offenders. They're acting out stories. So to understand the crimes, we need to understand these stories. And I mentioned school shooting earlier, and this is just a photo, an example of how this one guy, two Finnish school shooters, the one guy just completely copies the other one. He does a school shooting the next year, and he poses in the same way, and so on. So if you look for these kind of similarities, you can see how a lot of crimes, a lot of actions, harmful actions are just copycat thing where people find a story, get fascinated by it, emerges into it, and then try to copy it later. But counter narratives are also important, of course, and a particular emphasis in this talk. And counter narratives can be, or we define it in a paper as stories that challenge or oppose dominant stories, either in mainstream, social, and subcultural context. So it's these kind of stories that fight against a more dominant hegemonic discourse, try to fight back, try to find their own way, try to kind of do something about the main interpretations of the social environment they are in. So counter-narratives, for example, respond to or resist dominant cultural narratives and can support people in telling new and more helpful stories for their lives. This is one thing they can do. And it's also important that they don't have to be like completely opposite. It's just counter-narratives intertwined with dominant narratives. They can appeal to or include components of dominant narratives as part of their narrative resistance. So you can also take parts of a story and use it in your own counter-narrative. You can take part of a dominant story and use it in a more in a way to resist against the society that you're in. We have distinguished between different forms of narrative resistance, different forms of counter-narratives, and for it can be factual. You can say, no, this is not how it works. In a prison, for example, you can say, oh, the prison authority says this and this and this, but it works so well. We have this reintegration program. We had this education problem, but I've been here now for 10 years in this prison. And I know that these classes doesn't work, and they are only given like once a year, and it's very corrupt. All the officers are taking money for this and that. So that's kind of one way of telling a factual counter narrative. You can also tell emotional narrative. You can appeal to people's emotion. You can say, the main story is that we have these terrible people in prison, and they deserve it because they've done these horrible crimes. And then they could say, tell emotional stories about how life in prison is, for example, for them, how they have experienced it, how it's ruined them, how hard it is to be in maximum security and isolation, being with these other people. So that could be a kind of emotional counter narrative to the situation that they're in, to the mainstream interpretation of prison and of life of the people that are in prison. It can also be humorous. It can be funny. You can make fun of the prison system. You can make fun of the guards. You can make fun of mainstream society that hasn't realized how exciting and how lively and life can be, and how easy it can be to make money and so on. So it can also be humorous, like a very different approach from the more factual or emotional. And then finally, counter-narrative can also be silencing, can also be refusing to talk about things and so on. So when is it good to use a narrative approach? If you're interested in culture, life, world, meaning making, you can do it qualitatively, quantitatively, with statistics or with ethnography and so on. And it can be combined with studies of the body. For example, narrative habitus, as I mentioned before. So how to do it? Collect stories, analyze them as stories, as not as the truth. And that's an important thing, because that's our main instinct often as social scientists, at least, is to go out there, talk to people, and find the truth in one way or another. Is it done that way? How much does drug cost? How is this market organized? How are these stories that prisoners tell reflective of the objective realities of prison? And I'm not saying that's not important, because of course it is. I mean, we want to expose human rights violations. We want to expose terrible conditions in prison and so on. But a narrative approach would also say, well, these approaches, these stories do something for the people living in prison. For example, I'm very often surprised in these interviews how often people will say that the time has been good for them. It was wrong that I got into prison, but maybe God has a plan with it, or I learned this or that, and I'm going to come out as a better person. And for me, that's not very interesting as a truth. I mean, for once, I doubt that they have changed so much and so on. But that's not important. But I think as stories, they are so important, because it is a way to kind of survive in a terrible, terrible environment, and to give some kind of meaning to a completely meaningless waste of time as you experience when you are in prison. So people really need these stories in order to make sense of it for themselves, to kind of, and I think it's a survival mechanism in a way. I mean, if you spend 10, 20 years in prison and you can't say that you got anything out of it, it was just a complete waste of time. I think that's making people really depressed, and they need these kind of stories that life is moving on. They learn something from it. There was some kind of meaning behind it, via God as controlling it, or via more secular reasoning. So that's just one example of how a story is important in itself and not only as descriptive of the truth. So let me move fast on to a recent study we did in Mexico that worked as a kind of a pilot study for the study we're doing now. We did interviews with 24 participants, interviewed them 3 times, different crimes, Mexico City prison. And this was done with Gustavo Fondevilla and Carolina Goff, that both work in UNAM and in CIDE. And we had an interviewer who did the interviews for us, Veronica. And we tried to look at especially parenthood in prison. So we did one paper on that we call Doing Marginalized Motherhood. And the aim was to expand existing scholarship on how structurally disadvantaged mothers negotiated their identities. And we wanted to include the experiences of women in Latin America. And the background, you know it all, of course, but poverty, weak state, patriarchy, familialism, mayonismo identities, and so on. And what we found in this few interviews, we have to say that it wasn't that many, but we think it's kind of representative, is that becoming a mother was one way of escaping destructive families. Very many of them became mothers early, and we could see that they had some kind of problematic relationship in their own family. They got beaten by their fathers, for example, or so on, and they tried to create a new family in order to get away from the old one. But the paradox was, the problem was that because they were so young, they often got stuck in a new destructive family relation through the father of the child. So they would move in with the father and then sometimes become the servant of the mother-in-law and so on. So the autonomy they wanted by moving was really not there. They weren't able to leave the destructive families behind. They were just moving into another one, and life became much harder for them, because then at the age of surprisingly often 13, 14, 15 years old, they would also have to support a child and not only take care of themselves. And for some people, this was what led them into crime. They would have to engage in different kinds of criminal activities in order to provide for their child. Another way of doing motherhood was through breadwinning. So you could see, for example, when they ended up in prison, they would emphasize, before prison, they would emphasize that, maybe I didn't take care of my child like on a daily basis, but at least I did these and these crimes in order to get money to support the child I was living with, the grandmother or the mother-in-law or whomever. So this was something they continued with as soon as they got into prison. They continued, try to work in prison and send money out, and in that way trying to be mothers in a kind of masculine way by being breadwinners. That's typically what's traditionally is associated with male parental role. Like, oh, I'm a good father because I make money, I support for my kids, and so on. But these mothers would do the same in order to kind of emphasize that they were still good mothers. The paradox of what often happened was that when they came to prison, they took these courses in mothering and stuff, and then they learned that they were supposed to be mothers in a different way, in a more emotional way, in a more connected way. And so they were exposed to new norms for doing motherhood, dialectic relationship, directly mother-child, primarily emotional, and these were really difficult to achieve for these imprisoned and marginalized women. And maybe it was also problematic for their children, who may benefit from these more communal mothering practices that they had before that. So what we try to see in this paper is how motherhood differs depending upon life phase and the institutional and societal context of mothering, and how it can be a tragic resource for marginalized population. It's a resource in a way that you can get more autonomy, you can get away, you can get a new source of pride. If you're in prison, you can emphasize that you're first and foremost a mother and not a prisoner and not a criminal and so on. But in one way or the other, it always comes back at you. So one problem can be that the kind of family replaces welfare state institutions in other contexts, and childcare is often shared among female members across generations. And marginalized mothers often take up the role as a provider. And the problem is that sometimes in these prisons, the educational problems will be imported from the global north, will be imported from the US, especially in Mexico, and they don't have the kind of cultural sensitivity to adjust the programming to the lived realities of these imprisoned mothers. So they teach them one way of mothering that is really, I mean, I don't want to be cynical or anything, but it's really very far away from the kind of mothering that these women will ever be able to do, for once because they're in prison. So they might create trauma, they might create problems that doesn't necessarily have to be there if they instead were targeted against this kind of more shared ways of mothering and this shared way of communal mothering practices, which in many ways can be better for the children, I think. We did another stories of what we call stories of the good father. We compared the women to the men, and we saw that the men were also extremely concerned, or it was very important for them that they were father. So we tried to see, at the same time, they didn't have the same daily contact with their kids, neither before prison or when they went to prison. So it kind of had this kind of a mythological status. I wanted to call it the dreams of fatherhood, but because it had this kind of dreamlike character where it was something you wanted, it was something you thought about, it was something really important to you, but it was so disconnected from their real life that it was hard to see kind of the connection. So again, instead of looking at the kind of were they good fathers, probably most of them were not, or how did they do their fathering? If you look at it as stories, it takes on another and more important function. And I'll skip a couple of slides and go directly to the conclusions. So interestingly, the fatherhood they described was inspired by new narratives of involved fatherhood. Again, this kind of emotional connection. Sometimes they had punished or beaten their children, but they regretted it. They wanted to leave it behind. Very few defended it as part of a kind of disciplining in a more traditional way. So it seemed that these kind of new norms of fatherhood had also moved into prison. And they are important, we believe, because they can be a way to emotionally connect with, cope with time in prison in the same way as having changed, and that there is a meaning. It can be a way, at least I'm still a father. It can also be a way to do normalcy, to be doing something that's also everyone else does, also is out of prison. I mean, yes, I'm trying to teach my children these lessons and so on. And finally, it can also be a very important motivation for change, we believe. So fatherhood, motherhood, and so on, it's a kind of a different way of looking at people in prison and looking at how they also do normal thing, how they kind of strive towards normalcy, how they try to cope with emotions, and so on. I'll continue to the new project that we call Crimla, where we interview prisoners in Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. 900 interviews, 300 participants, 15 researchers. And one of the main aims are to study social, economic, and institutional factors that shape crime in Latin America. And it's also important for us to study transitions, turning points, trajectories, and life stories. And the role of family in these life stories, the role of employment, the role of culture, drug trafficking organization, and the state, not the least. And just to show a couple of pictures from the fieldwork that we're doing, and this is from Chile, on our way in to do an interview there. One picture we were able to take from the inside, very fascinating. I was very fascinated by the kind of street life atmosphere in the prison, and I've seen the same in Mexico and Honduras and Argentina as well. That the difference from hanging out in the street, listening to music, playing some sports, having a small fight, having a big discussion, this kind of bustle of street life, the difference is really not that big from outside of prison and inside of prison, the kind of masculinities at place that you can see there. Also another important thing that we try to study is the economy of the prison, how people depend on getting food and getting stuff. We also did a paper on that from the outside in order to make it in prison. So how things are organized, very much like semi-legally as a market inside of prison. Privacy, how you try to deal with, speaking about bodies, I mean, it doesn't get more bodily than this, right? The visits, the intimacy visits, how that is organized, controlled by the prison authorities, how people try to rebel against it in different ways. From an interview I did yesterday, she told me that during visit times in prison here in Mexico City, you could see like people sneaking away and trying to have sex in some kind of hidden places. Another one talked about prostitution, how it was organized with prostitution, how they were able to prostitute while still being in prison, and so on. So all these different ways that bodies are controlled and resist in prison. So the authorities try to control them, and the prisoners try to resist. And then sometimes and often there is some kind of compromise where, well, we have these rules, but we're willing to ignore them in different cases, or if you pay this or that, you can get away with stuff. But it's this constant negotiations and fights between prison authorities and prisoners. So the method we use is a kind of, since I had this background as an ethnographer, it's important for me to kind of get ethnographic data. At the same time, it's very difficult and hard to systematize if you want to do like a big study. So it's also more effective often to talk to people. So in order to kind of make a compromise between ethnography and a more typical interview studies, we in this study we meet people 3 times. So we talk to them for 1.5 hours approximately every time. And we have some time between the meetings. So in that sense, we try to get more trust from them, more nuances and details in the stories. Sometimes we get different versions of the same event. They would tell one version in one interview and another one in the next one, and get to know them better. And we also feel that it's more ethical in a way, because instead of just going in there, doing a quick interview, running out again, we establish some kind of personal relationship to the people that we interview, and they also get an opportunity to, if they are bombarded with questions that they didn't think much about for the first interview, they can have some time to process it, to think about it, and then for the next interview, I always open with the question saying, well, what have you thought about since the last talk we had? I mean, what kind of ideas did I set up? Did you get from the first interview, or how will you reflect on the kind of talk that we had the last time? And then you often hear them saying, well, I think I forgot to tell you this which is really important, or I think I might have exaggerated this, or so you get this kind of trying to get as close to the stories they want to tell as possible. And I think it's also an advantage for getting nuanced counter narratives. So not only getting the first one, well, the prison guards are terrible, we hate them, it's just problems here. And then maybe in the next interview they will say, well, I can understand where they're coming from too. They're also poor. I mean, they come from these families that don't have any money, and the salary they make in prison is a low one. So I can understand why they try to get a little bit extra through corruption and so on. So I think these kind of more nuanced stories are important and easier to get when we have several meetings. So some kind of counter narratives from prisons that we have gotten here: motherhood, fatherhood. I think these are examples of stories that challenge or oppose dominant stories. When the fathers say that their children is the most important thing for them, and they would do anything for them, and they want to change because of their children, I think that presents another story than the one we usually associate with men in prison. And also I was very surprised by this motherhood story about how providing economically for their children was so important. So I think that's also kind of a counter stories. Friendship can be challenged the way we think about this when they describe friendship. We try in this study not only to talk about crime and not only to talk about the bad thing. We want to try to talk about normal things as well, in order to get these other stories from prison and get this other impression of these people. Romantic relationship, political criticism, for example, it can be very surprising, very nuanced analysis sometimes, personal reflections, and so on. And we also ask them about cultural expressions. And that's a paper we just started working on now, on what kind of role music can play in prison. And I wish I could play some of the, because sometimes the interviewees, the prisoner that we interview, have started singing in the middle of the interview to illustrate a point. I had one guy I interviewed in Chile, and I was taking a little bit of break just to check some notes, and suddenly he started singing his favorite song. and I said, okay, tell me about this song, please sing more, and so on. And he sung another song, and unfortunately he sung a song that I knew, and we sung this song together. And I think it really opened up the space in that interview. It really changed that interview, where you could see how these cultural expressions were important for him. Sometimes he couldn't explain things in his own words, his own feelings, and he would refer to a song. He would sing this song instead. And in some, I wish I could play it for you, but with technology, I didn't take the chance of trying to play that. In other interviews, I've interviewed people who are rappers, so they make their own music. We have one from Honduras and one from Mexico, and they would sing songs that they made themselves. One singing about the maximum security, his experiences there. And he told me he made a song when he was in maximum security and they were isolated, and he would sing it out loud. And afterwards, they couldn't see each other. They could just hear him singing. And afterward, everyone would be clapping and saying, wow, you really put what we feel into these words, into these songs. You really managed to process that. And now, for various reasons that I don't have the time to go into, he was very much keeping to himself. So he was trying to live as alone as he could in prison. And he told me still I keep making these songs. I record them on this illegal mobile phone that I have, but these songs are only for me. And I write about my relationship to my mom. I write about my relationship to my girlfriend on the outside. I write about everything that I've experienced in this life, and I sing them for myself. I don't sing them for anyone else. So I think these are also kind of counter narratives that are important. And I'll just give you, because I haven't had time enough, since these interviews were just done a couple of weeks ago, to process it into a real argument yet. But this is just one example from Colombia. It's not from an interview I did, it's from an interview someone else did with another guy who was making music, and he made this very critical song about how society was ruined by these colonial states, United States, France, and so on, and how people were suppressed by that. And also, this is also a rap song that he sung during the interview. So it's very powerful, these cultural expressions, and very important for them. And I think it's a very good example of embodied counter narrative. I mean, you can see the way they perform it during the interview that it's kind of part of who they are, and at the same time it's telling a story that's important for them. So this is kind of political criticism, counter narrative, as you can see. Seeing it in words on a PowerPoint is, I know, it's very alienating. So just imagine, close your eyes and imagine a guy in this overcrowded, underfunded prison, sitting in a corner singing this song, maybe for himself, maybe for some other listening, and that's the real experience. This is another song. You can see the kind of more gangster discourse. This is from Mexican prison. The gangster discourse that I mentioned in the beginning, how they turn that also into cultural expressions. This guy was bilingual, so he was rapping in both the Spanish and English, and he made songs where he started out in Spanish, and then he had a verse in English, and then he went back and forth. And this is kind of more typical gangster trap rap, where you try to put yourself above everyone else because you're harder and cooler and so on. And this was a super marginalized guy in so many different ways. Even in prison, he was very low in the hierarchy in prison for various reasons. But that he was a performing artist was a way for him to kind of stand out from the others. So people would know, well, this is the guy who's rapping, and it gave him so much pride and so much comfort. He was also doing more emotional things in other songs with a relationship with his family and so on. That it was clearly a very important story for him, a very important activity, very important embodied way of the way he was being. He was acting. He was living in life as a rapper. I mean, this was how he talked, how he behaved, how he walked. It wasn't just making the songs and then going back to another life. But it was also a counter narrative. It was also a way to say, I'm something other than what you think. I'm something other than what you maybe expect, and so on. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap it up. Apologies for running very fast through this. I mean, these are maybe 15 papers squeezed into one very short PowerPoint presentation. But the ways forward, I think, in terms of narrative analysis in this field is to focus. So far, social science usually look for how narratives report what is true in these stories and so on, and or how people try to account for or neutralize criminal behavior. But within this narrative criminology framework and within this new project, we also try to see how stories integrate, entertain, deal with traumatizing experiences, educate, raise emotions, draw boundaries, all this kind of work that stories do. So this is one thing we try to do. Another thing we try to do is try to see these stories as as plurivocal instead of univocal. Like, I think a lot of people present stories from people, marginalized people, anywhere, other people as kind of either stories that want to say we should feel very sorry for this because they have experienced this and this, they had very terrible lives. That could be one, like univocal stories. These are victims. Other people try to say these are terrible people who are running terrible businesses and ruining a lot of lives through their lifestyle. So that's another univocal stories. And I think social science and media, even more than social science, tend to go for this kind of stereotypes. So looking at long, complex life stories is a way to try to avoid that univocality and try to look for ambiguity and plurivocality. How people are different things at the same time. How people can be super bad and at the same time have something else going. I mean, people are complex, right? Bodies are complex. So stories is a nice way to try to access that kind of plurivocality if we want to. And I think we haven't done it enough in the social sciences so far. We always want to have it black or white. We want to have a simple conclusion. We want to have a simple story. We want to feel this or feel that. But in reality, feelings, emotions, stories are very complex and very put together in various very different ways, and people are many things at the same time, and we can access that through their storytelling. Another thing, we have primarily studied what is told. We can also study cognitive cues, tropes, assumption, implicit statements that rely on narrative structure to be understood. So in this way, try to understand the stories that are not told too is important, I think. And finally, as the topic of this talk and this presentation, I think it's really, really important to study counter-narratives, Contranarrativas, how the unexpected ones, how people try to fight oppressive systems, how people try to get back at the society that ruined them by different ways, by trying to be harder, tougher, by trying to be normal, by trying to all these kind of strategies or things people do in order to kind of deal with the situation that they are in. And if we look for that, I think we will see people as much more complex, not only as victims of these socioeconomic structures that they're living in, but also see the agency, also see the kind of life, to see the kind of power they do have, even in completely powerless situations, to define their own lives and so on. So I think that's a super important topic for further studies, these counter narratives. Finally, just the three studies, if anyone are interested, from Mexico that we have published so far. It's going to come a lot more in the next couple of years, but these are kind of based on that small pilot study that we did in the beginning with Carolina Agoff and Gustavo Fondevilla. So if anyone would be interested in any of those arguments, they can get them in more detail here. And also, if anyone is interested in narrative criminology, they can write me an email and I can send you some publications, because I know I went very fast through it in this talk, so it might be hard to follow, but don't be afraid to write me and ask me for some of the publications that are behind the arguments in this talk. Okay, I'm going to say thank you now, and looking forward to the questions.
Excellent, Sven. It's been very, very, very great and interesting to hear you. Thank you for getting like so much information, so much experience, so many ideas in one presentation. I'm sure that the audience will be very, very interesting in following and keeping like the track on your work, especially because of these all these issues that are related to the Mexican context in prisons that probably are not very it's not a very usual way to approach the prison reality, I think. Not only because I'm sure this is something that you have seen with this Krimla project, but because some countries are very, very private in the way that you can do research in prisons. You know, like it's very you have to be very careful how you get into, how do you deal with authorities, with people in prison, with what you see, you know, because even though you are only like addressing one person to interview, I mean, when you are in prison, you know that you can see so much around, so like you know, so it's not easy. What I'm saying is that it's not an easy thing to do to get into prisons, not at least in Mexico, and do research and to be sure to make sure that you can go back next time and they will allow you to get in. You know, so even though that's the situation, I think what you have done with Gustavo and Carolina are very relevant in researches. Well, according to following what you have exposed and present, I have a few ideas that I would like to go a bit deeper, maybe, especially trying to connect what you have said with some of the ideas that have been exposed in the earlier days. Thinking of one idea that philosopher Ana Maria Martinez de la Escalera, who was who was presenting on Monday with David Romero, I think I forgot his last name, but they were talking about the idea that we are not born as bodies, but we are bodies in the making. You know, so they approach this idea of becoming a body from a biological perspective, from a philosophical, from a social perspective, how the relationship with the environment, since you are born, that's making you like to become a certain kind of body or a specific kind of body. And what I like very much about the narrative perspective that you have just presented is the idea that if we are really bodies in the making, that means that we are, in a way, we have the possibility to narrate or to make our own narrative, to create our own narrative. But the thing is that with people in prison, particularly, they have a lot of limitations, according to what we have seen or what we have, or people, we people who work with people in prison, we know that conditions in prison are always very sui generis in many ways. But still, this idea of nuances that you mentioned, do you think that that's exactly the opportunity or the chance they have to, even though they have all these obstacles and all these limitations of law, stigma, punishment, control, segregation, racial, this racial, you know, like narrative that it's dominant and imposed on them. Do you think this idea of nuances will help to make this possibility of tell, of create or build or make a body in a different way, like breaking the determinism that all these dominant narrative will have on the bodies?
Yeah, I think so. I think you make perfect arguments. I'm not sure what to add. I mean, I think you can find this the repertoire they have of stories. That's the repertoire for making different bodies, no? So if the aim is the systems or the aim is to change people, I think you have to work with particular narratives, and that's why people have a very cynical attitude towards prisoners sometimes, and people with problem, and they say, well, they talk about being good fathers and they talk about change and blah blah blah, but look at their life, they've only made a havoc so far, and I've seen these people before and they're gonna come back in prison again because this is who they are. And I'm not so sure. I mean, because I think even I see the cynical point too, but even if you have that kind of glimpse of hope, if you have that kind of dream, I think it means something. I mean, I think they're not lying when they say they want to be good fathers, they want to have an emotion, want to catch up with their kids, they're gonna everything's gonna. I think you have to work on the positive parts. You have to work on those parts of their stories that are constructive and that could leave, could go in good direction. So I think if you work with that and kind of acknowledge that this is a story they want to live out. It might be a dream, it might not come true, but at least there is something there. I think that's something to work on. And if you work on those stories and you kind of emphasize that, I think they can change in these directions. It's always going to be hard because they're going to fight all these other stories, right? And all these other bodies that they have within them. And it takes time to change the body. But I think definitely instead of imposing something from completely from the outside, like something completely new, if you work with the kind of positive stories they already have, music is the same thing. I mean, if you work with the music, if you work with a kind of artistic thing in them, I think it's a way to kind of for them to become new people, become new bodies, and so on by extending something that they are already, instead of trying to impose something completely new. I don't think you can take a 25, 30-year-old guy and make him into a musician. But if you take people who already have that in them and work on it, and they want to be it, I think that's the way to go. So yeah, definitely.
Yes.
People have different bodies. I mean, yes, it is habitus, yes, it is constrained, but they also have different potentials within them. And if you work with the good ones, you can change. Maybe you can't change everything, but you can change a little bit in a good way.
Yes, and besides, because there are these, I mean, there are some kind of, we can call them facts that they seem to be resistant to counter narratives. I'm talking about, for example, the idea of the color of your skin, the idea of being a man or a woman, and these kind of facts, because I believe that in some way they become facts because narratives make them to see like that, like they cannot be changed. But what we can change is exactly the way we relate to that kind of facts. So what I'm saying is that narratives in this context will help us to not only to see in a different way bodies that we have seen in a racist, discriminative, exclusive way, but also the possibility of constructing from outside the prison new facts on this idea of who these people are in prison, because maybe one of the problems that I'm talking about, particularly the case of Mexico, but I'm sure this is the same condition in other countries, is the idea that what happens in prison is not necessarily a social issue. You know, like there's society and then there is prison. I know is one of the main problems, and this is taking me to another question that I know you are not really into the public policy thing, but in a way, this is related to something that has been discussed in this week during this event, during these readings. The idea of what do you need in order to change this social reality? If I'm thinking about the use of data, the use of numbers, the use of the narrative or of numbers, basically, of and the idea that you need numbers in order to change the structure. However, you said at some point something that I really like, that you said, okay, all these people have different stories, but in a way, the narrative structure is the same. It seems to me that this narrative structure reflects or resembles the social structure in a way. You know, like this is a way in which we can understand how this social structure that makes people to be punished, to be seen as criminal, to be seen as non-humans sometimes, is exactly the image of works exactly in the same way that these narrative structures work. So the question would be, how do you think that this narrative, this is ethnographic way to understand the content of prisons? Because in a way, these life stories are a content, you know, like makes prisons an institution, would be useful to think from the outside, from the state perspective, important to make like real changes in order to make a room for different narratives. You know, like this because if you have, I mean, when you talk about this guy who says, you say that he has this narrative. Let me try to rephrase a bit. This guy who has the gangster narrative, and you mentioned something like, okay, he was not into the small talk narrative. So if you take him out of that context, he basically has nothing to say, apparently. You know, so it makes sense in his own narrative to mean something. But on the other side, people who are outside this context see with rejection, with fear, talking about emotions. We are afraid of listening to those narratives, not only because they mean menace, you know, like they are threatening us, but they also mean that we are doing something wrong as society, you know. So this kind of conflict. So trying to rephrase all that I have said, that I hope is kind of clear in a way, or making sense in a way. How do we, people outside prison, we deal with these stories that are making in the same society that we are living? They're not stories that were built in prison. They're stories that were or bodies that were built in the same society that we share. Those narratives were outside. Why we have to wait until these people are in prison to deal with them, to have this, you call it interdiscursivity. How do we create this interdiscursivity with these narratives in prison from the outside, not only from the researcher view, but from society view?
No, good questions, and I don't think I have the answers because they are very big, you know. But just to start with an observation you had in the beginning, how hard it is to get into prison. I mean, I could talk about that for an hour. And I think it's funny in a strange way, because everything else can get into prison. They have drugs, they have all kinds of whatever they want. They can manage to get it in, but to get in one ethnographer,
They are dangerous.
the hardest thing to get into a prison is an ethnographer or a social scientist. I think that's funny, and it's also related to some of your other questions. And of course, it's because they're afraid of these stories, like the system. They don't know what are these guys doing here. Are they gonna like reveal stuff that we want to keep hidden? I mean, do they want to reveal the corruption? Will I look bad? Will I get fired because there is some kind of study showing that this system doesn't work? So I can also understand why they're worried, because they're afraid. I mean, they don't want to, and also part of the system, they don't want to see prisoners as people, right? And they kind of get the sense that, what do you want to talk with this terrible guy for 5-6 hours? I mean, do you know what he did? You know he deserves to be here. So it's also this kind of fear of the stories, and that shows the power of stories, I think, because you say, yeah, we need numbers to change, and policy is often directed towards numbers. Yes, it is, but it's also very much directed towards stories, right? I mean, if you get other stories out, I think stories sometimes are more powerful than numbers. If you manage to get the right stories out in the right way. And that's also related to the last questions, or how do we deal with this interdiscursivity? Because that's when it's complex. That's when you get a conflict between policy and research. Because I think policy, if you're left-leaning, you want to say these guys are in prison for the wrong reason. This system doesn't work. It doesn't rehabilitate them. And then you want these stories. If you're on the right side politically, you would say these guys have done terrible things. They deserve to be there. We should put even more people in prison because we have a huge problem with crime in Mexico, right? So both parts of politics want to present these kind of simple stories. And then when we go there and we look for the interdiscursivity, when we look for this kind of ambiguity, it doesn't really fit the policy story. So I think, yes, stories can be powerful, but interdiscursive stories, they can only make the world a more complex place. So I'm not sure how much they're going to change, because in the 1 minute they tell you about how they murdered this other person, very detailed, blah, 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 blah. And so in the next minute they tell, well, I also experienced all this abuse and the prison system doesn't work. So what do you do with that story? I mean, it doesn't come with a clear-cut conclusion, right? It doesn't come with, no, let's abolish all the prisons. They lack this kind of simple conclusion that policy is looking for. So I'm not sure what is needed to change, but I think this is, I mean, I've been arguing against the truth during that, but I think this is the truth. If you want the truth about people in prison, about crime, it is this interdiscursivity. It is this super complexity that people are bad and good at the same time and so on. So I can't imagine that having this knowledge in one way or the other, that presenting these more complex stories wouldn't somehow benefit policymaking. It doesn't come with a clear-cut conclusion, but I think it comes with truth. It comes with explaining to people, politicians, ordinary people, media, that no, life isn't as black and white as you want it to be. It's complex. It's difficult. So yeah, I know it's not an easy one, but I think that's the way to go. And then looking at more detail at particular stories, I think you can work with them. And one thought I have is that when everyone's saying that everything is corrupt in Mexico all the time, right? That's a very destructive story. I mean, it might partly be the case, but it also opens up for everyone to be corrupt. So it gives an excuse for the prison guards to be corrupt. It gives an excuse for prisoners to be committing more crime, because this is just so. I think in what way it's necessary or important to build some other stories about society, other stories about Mexican society, for example, because some of the stories we hear all the time are very destructive in a way that they direct people towards some very harmful actions, even though there might be something to it. And these stories that everyone is just fighting for themselves and so on. Yes, I can see why this is a dominant story, but I can also see the destructive work it does. I mean, so I think it's important to build up other more constructive stories, and stories can be very powerful in that way. And of course, if you have a very more detailed policy ambition, like you want to get rid of corruption, you want to get rid of the violence in prison, you want to get rid of more terrible prison conditions, 20 people in one cell built for 3 people and so on. The stories we collect in prison are super powerful. I mean, you can just basically print them out and go and see if you can get it published in a newspaper or somewhere, or even more powerful, if you can get the prisoners to tell these stories themselves. It's more powerful than having researchers telling them. So if you can make a program for having prisoners talk, if you can kind of put the face to it, not hide it behind numbers and so on, I think it's potentially very, very, very powerful, but also comes with a lot of dilemmas. So I know I don't have a good answer. But.
No, I think you have said so many interesting things, and yes. Well, I want to ask because it seems there are questions from the audience. So Agustin is gonna help us with translating.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again, Sven. Maria asks us, what do you think about the positions that consider that knowing the narratives of whom have made crime a felony knowing these narratives imply to humanize them, and they consider this as a negative point to whomever has committed a crime?
Very good question. I think it means humanizing them, but I also think that it's very important to humanize them because they are humans. And I would, and it's a way to kind of see them and understand them and feel their pain. And I can also say, I also want to say that, yes, it is humanizing, but if I take some parts of my interviews with them, they're gonna be seen as animals. I mean, because they can spend half hour on describing how they torture people and how they kill people and so on. So it's also the responsibility of the researchers, right? That's this intertextuality, interdiscursivity that makes it so hard. If I want to, I can edit this 5-hour interview and I can make them into the nicest person in the world, and humanize them, like, so everyone would feel sympathy for them. I feel sympathy for them, and that, or I can also edit it in a way that would dehumanize them, just by taking out some other parts. So yeah, I think it humanizes in the overall. I think it generally humanizes, and I think that's a good thing because we should humanize them.
Yeah, but also I think with what you said, Sven, maybe what we should change a bit is the idea that being human necessarily means to be good. You know, it's part of our reality, our nature. It's not like, you know. So
I agree.
Okay, I don't know if there's another question.
I have one, if I may. You're proposing, and I think it sounds awesome to have a polyphony of voices, not just study single narratives or take them as a Greek chorus, but as different individual narratives. But coming from a journalistic point of view, the power of one single big narrative is, I think, it's also can be very strong. In Mexico's case specifically, we used to have, he was very tragically and sadly killed this year, deputy, a representative known as El Mijis, who was Pedro César Carrizales. And he spent 2 years in prison, and he had the kind of tattoos that you get in prison and the look of a person that you will normally associate with being in prison. How do you think this big narrative, as someone who was in prison and still used to look as a person who was in prison, as a representative, as a part of the government and taking decisions for the society, how can this big single narrative could change prevention or reinsertion, or the people that are in prison see themselves?
No, I think it's very important, and that's also why I'm sometimes reluctant of scientists or NGOs and stuff going into prison and coming out and representing the prisoners' case, telling their stories in a way. I'm not sure if I want to do that. I think the role is maybe something else, to interpret them in a different way or going in a particular direction, because I think people should basically represent themselves. And we can create this platform, and we can find these people, as you say, if there are some who have this background and so on, and we can use them. I think that in terms of politics and policy, this is maybe better, because people should represent themselves. And then maybe our job as researchers, I know a lot of researchers have a very political agenda, and I sympathize with that political agenda, but I still think research is something else. I mean, yeah, we should try to struggle to get better prison conditions and so on, and better reintegration and so on. But I also think we should try to be critical towards those things, and that's where the complexity comes in. But I agree, the power of stories who have been there, that's, I mean, if you want to do political change, this is the way to do it. I think it's a very good example of that.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. You let me know if there's any other question from the audience, Agus. I cannot avoid to ask you something more about something that that has to do with your own narrative, Sven, like being Norwegian. When we talk about how the penal or the law system, the justice system should go to make it better, we all know that in Mexico there's a common place to refer to the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden. Like that's the way we should go to make an equal society and human rights society. And but at the same time, I am very much into these new ways of trying to the idea of decentralize the idea of criminology coming from the north. I'm thinking about these projects from Oxford University with this idea of Southerizing criminology, or thinking of an idea of criminology from Latin American perspective. Just a few days ago, I was listening to this criminologist from the West Indies University in Trinidad and Tobago talking about the importance of avoiding thinking criminology from these regions as peripheral. Like the idea that there's still some kind of burden from the criminologist academia trying to understand what's happening in the south of the planet, basically. And I'm being kind of no making fun or anything, but I think we all understand, people who are dealing with prisons and justice systems, I think we all understand that this is a global problem. This is not only a problem of some countries. Everything there's a need of interdiscursivity between countries, between systems, between ways of dealing with human problems. But I would like to know more, to dig a bit more into what makes you to be interested in criminology. I mean, in the crime scene, so to speak, using this this term, in Latin America, in Mexico, because what I've seen is that you have not really so much work in your own background context, like you have tried to see from other places.
I think the question is, what are you doing? What is this blonde guy doing? Who's he trying to come to tell us how this works in Mexico? I got this. That's another version of the question. I got this question. I had a presentation in Chile, and he was very explicit, and he said, "What are you coming here for? I mean, you European blonde guy. Who do you think you are?" No. And I told him,
Mexicans, that Mexicans, we are very polite with the way we tell things. I'm sure you are used to it.
No, and I agree for so many reasons. I mean, I'm also very sympathetic to this Southern criminology movement, and I think it's very important that people take criminology and that's what I was trying to, and make it their own and not copy. There's a lot of studies from Mexico that I read that's kind of copying these US models and try to see how it fits Mexico. And I would say it doesn't really fit because the context is completely different. So maybe you have the same numbers and you can use the same theory in this way, but it doesn't really transfer because the context is so different. So I sympathize with that. At the same time, I think as an ethnographer, I mean, that's what ethnographers always has done. They've gone into places where they're not from, right? And they try to see it with its kind of outsider perspectives. And here I try to work closely with local researchers in order to get both the benefits of the outside perspectives and the benefits of the inside perspective, and try to combine that. And as I told the guy in Chile, the reason I'm doing it because I was in Mexico because of my wife, because of my family, right? She got a job here. I was here as a criminologist. I would think, okay, this would be a shame, right? If you're a criminologist from Norway and you're going to spend 3-4 years in Mexico and you don't do anything on the crime scene in Mexico, that would be a complete waste, because after all, it's a bigger problem and it's more important than the crime scene in Norway. So that's a very pragmatic reason for why I ended up, like my personal narrative, how I ended up in this. And I also believe there are important similarities. People keep telling me, well, it's so different, it's so different. I don't know. I mean, when I talk to people, Somali drug dealers on the streets of Oslo, Norwegian high-level drug dealers in prison, I see a lot of similarities, to be honest. Yeah, I realize that the context is very different, but the way people are, the way they feel their emotions, the way they behave bodily, and so on, I think there are a lot more similarities than we sometimes think there are. So that's my one concern. I mean, I sympathize 95% with Southern criminology and this kind of decolonization movement and so on, and I think it's very important. But my only little concern is if we think things are that different, like you can't come from another context and try to understand. You will have to have lived here for 100 years in order to understand. Everything is organized differently. People are so different. I don't know. Okay, prove it to me. Tell me what is different, and I can see if I can see some similarities from the context that I know better. And I think, yeah, we have to move towards decolonization. I mean, the global South, not only Latin America, but Africa and other places too, that have bigger and less represented than Latin America are. I mean, has to, you know, has to have that movement, has to take it back, have to make it their own. At the same time, I think it's important not. There is a certain racism in saying that everything is different and there are no comparisons, and I think that kind of takes away the general human nature that, after all, controls us. I mean, one small example is narrative structure, as you mentioned. How come these narrative structures are so similar in these completely different contexts? I think it's because we're all human and we have some kind of organizing the world that is common in all societies that are put together by humans.
Yeah, and in your benefit, I would say that you could have chosen not to go into the criminal scene in Mexico. I mean, you are here because of your circumstances, but I really believe that working with even if you have the protection of an academic view, to get into these stories emotionally, personally, is very, very you need to be, I don't want to say courage, because I don't believe it's a kind of courage. You have to be very engaged to a reality, to a historical moment, to a human condition, in order to get into it. Because you could have been here. I mean, come here and go to the beaches and have your beer and forget about it. You know, I mean, you could have chosen something else, some other scenario to do research. However, you got into probably one of the most difficult scenarios that we have in Mexico. That it's criminology and prisons. So yeah, I think it's really important, and we are almost in time to finish this.
And just to say that also motivates me, because I think I can take someone back to Europe. I mean, I can kind of, I think now in Europe, the impression of crime in Mexico, and it's like, this is a complete havoc. This is like, because you only get the worst news. Yeah, you know, the worst news. And these are the ones that are getting transferred to Europe and the US as well. And I think that if I get some other things, a more complex, a more nuanced image of Mexico and Latin America, I can kind of take that with me and take it back to global north, or whatever you call it, in order to kind of present a more nuanced thing, in order to see more similarities, in order not to feed this kind of image of Mexico as being completely crazy in terms of crime. And I think it's more complex than that. I think that's important to kind of communicate also. Yeah, we know there's a lot of terrible things happening, but also, yeah, these are really nice fathers in prisons, sometimes jailed for the wrong reasons, and it's understandable why a lot of these people do crime, because of the social context and the economic context and so on. So I think that's also kind of, you can be some kind of mediator.
Yeah, and also the actions or the way, as a researchers, we deal with these events. It's interesting how you start finding people who are thinking in a way the same way, or is going forward, or maybe what you have done can be more strengthened with an idea that is going on in Asia, in East Europe, in Canada, in New Zealand. And I think this is not about countries anymore. I think this is more about exactly what you said. It's just a human condition thing. And in order in order not to forget that these people are humans, we have to go to the fundamentals. That it's that no matter where you're born, you're human. You know, that's the basic of all. And I think that's really important in this exercise of taking us closer to the narratives. We shouldn't forget that we all have a life story that is accompanying us, you know, like all this way in life. So thank you. I don't know if you want to say anything else, Sven, in order to, we have 5 minutes to finish this talk. It's been wonderful, really, really wonderful to hear you, to have you here. I want to thank you for accepting, and I hope this is not the only time that you are with us. Agustin, Elena have recently joined me in the work that I have been doing in prisons for the last years. They just joined me 6-7 months ago, and this event, in a way, was took place, like the idea became just from the experience of dealing with these narratives, like dealing with these ideas of we should talk about this from different perspectives. We have to hear people talking about how their experience with prisons are, and so on. So yeah, please have the last words for the.
I think we're all human. I think that's a nice way to end it. No. I don't have anything to add to that, but yeah, I would love to hear more about your project later. But yeah, we could take that on email. But yeah, let's keep everyone who's doing like similar research. It would be super interesting to get in contact. I know the pandemic has ruined a lot of like stuff in terms of meeting people, but hopefully we're back to normal now. So let's keep in touch.
Yes. So, and this talk are better.
Thank everyone who's listening, of course.
No, thank you, and we can talk about these things with a beer, and that's much better. And summer is coming, so rain and sun together is always a good scenario. Okay, thank you very much, Sven, Agus, María Elena, thank you, Senart, Centro de Ciencias Genómicas, y Posgrado de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la UAM por el apoyo para tener este tipo de diálogos. Y bueno, Agus, no sé si quieras decir algo más.
Pues ya, todo quedó. Muchas gracias, thank you very much. Y recuerden, hoy tenemos otras 2 pláticas. A la 1 nos vamos a reunir con Vivet García Dresder, justamente para platicar sobre narrativas, en este caso sobre herencia, cómo se discuten desde la prisión y en la sociedad mexicana. Y después vamos a hablar sobre los artistas en el encierro, en el caso específico de David Alfaro Siqueiros y José Revueltas, con Silverio Orduña y Javier Tapia desde La Tallera. Muchas gracias y nos vemos al rato. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sven.